First caller out of Midland, Texas. We've got Eddy. Thanks for waiting.
Hey, how are you doing, Matt?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I waited till this weekend to call in because you were the moderator for the Robert Price and Bart Ehrman debate.
Yeah.
And I heard some of your when you were on a group phone call with I believe it's Richard Carrier and there are a couple other people, and you guys were discussing the after the debate.
Right, yeah. So for those who aren't aware, Mythicist Milwaukee put on a debate between Bob Price and Bart Ehrman about whether or not Jesus existed as a historical figure. I was the moderator, and after the debate was over, I did a number of discussions, including the one that Eddy heard with Richard Carrier, giving our thoughts about the debate, about what went right, what went wrong, and my views in general. So what question or comment did you have about that?
Well, basically, my comment is I think if you're going to take the Jesus Mythicist position, it's almost as tenable as taking a flat Earth position. And
well, no, actually, because we have concrete evidence that the Earth isn't flat, wouldn't you say?
Right, and
do we have concrete evidence? Do we have concrete evidence that Jesus existed that is comparable to that for which we have that the Earth is not flat?
Well, it depends. We have the letters of Paul where he says...
Paul never met Jesus, did he? Did Paul ever meet Jesus, the living Jesus?
Well, if I recall correctly, didn't he say he met his brother?
Okay, so...
How do you meet the brother of a mythical guy?
So you've got a bunch of stories. Do you have anything other than testimonials? I mean, if all we had to determine that the Earth wasn't flat was a handful of people who said that the Earth wasn't flat, then you'd be able to compare the two.
See, this is where I think you're being disingenuous, and here's why. If you took any other historical circumstance where someone wrote a letter and I said, oh, hey, I went and visited Matt Dillahunty's brother, nobody would ever say, it's almost like because it's Jesus, well, we're going to say it's a myth.
Yes.
If I had said, hey, I went and visited Matt Dillahunty's brother, I went and visited Matt Dillahunty's brother, and you had my letter,
yeah,
nobody would think you were a myth.
Right, but does that mean I have a brother?
No,
Is that enough to reasonably conclude that I have a brother just because somebody said they met my brother?
In a letter, I would presume that the preponderance of the evidence is in favor of you having a brother if it's written down. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's what happens as far as historical methods. If somebody is presented as a real, living, breathing figure, then because we can't prove they're not, we don't have time machines. We generally just assume they do. But it's not like we're saying we're absolutely convinced that that's the case. There's a number of urban legends and myths where at different times people were convinced these were actual historical figures, and then we come to find out that perhaps they weren't. Paul Bunyan, King Arthur, etc. So, the issue here, let's say that you become convinced that I'm real because somebody told you, or that I actually existed because you read a note where somebody said they met my brother. Okay? Cool. What else do you know about me?
Well, I also know if we use that same Jesus scenario, I also know from Paul's letters that he went and hung out with 3 of Jesus' closest disciples.
I understand that, but what do you know about Jesus from Paul?
I know he existed.
Well, no, I don't think you know he existed. It's just that you're convinced that that's a reasonable explanation that he existed. And I'm not saying you're wrong. I specifically have not taken up the mythicist position.
Well, I'd be curious to hear the verse that we're talking about. I mean, I think that would be
I believe it's in Galatians. In Galatians, Paul says he went up to Jerusalem, and that's where he met with James, the brother of the Lord.
Sure.
Right, but I guess I want to look at... I'm going to go ahead and look it up. Y'all can continue the discussion.
Well, it was actually part of the debate, this James, the brother of the Lord, and it's something that Carrier and I talked about whether it means
there was a question. Right, there's a question because the term brother was used between Christians. I mean...
But if you read the text, and you read the text in Greek, which I'm learning Greek, the way you would read it is just like Bart Ehrman said. There's really only one way to read that is it was
actually Richard Carrier disputed that. So, but I'm not an expert either. Let me get to the point here. Let's assume for a second that Jesus actually existed. I have no problem with that there was somebody named Jesus that these people were talking about. Were they all talking about the same person? What facts from this person's life can we be confident about?
Well, okay, I think we could fairly say there's a couple things. I think we could say that there was at least a guy named Jesus. I think we could say that he was executed under Pontius Pilate. I think there's enough historical evidence that supports both of that. And I guess my main gripe is if you look at what the mythicists have to go through and the way they have to dance around to get to their position, I mean, they have to basically, and this is why the debate didn't work. You can't have someone on stage like Robert Price saying, you know, we have the 7 undisputed Pauline epistles, right? Scholars just don't dispute them now. But then you have him coming out and saying that, well, I dispute them.
Yes, he does.
Okay,
and so
well,
this is
flat Earth.
So Eddie,
flat Earth.
Eddie, any individual?
Yeah.
No, it's not like flat Earth.
I thought Price's book was really well received. I mean, I could be wrong.
Price holds a number of incredibly unorthodox views, even among some of the scholarly mythicists. And this is what Ehrman took him to task for with regard to, like, for example, there are a number of Pauline epistles that just almost everybody says, yep, these were written by Paul. Then there's a few others that most scholars say weren't written by Paul. And then there's some that are in question, like 2 Thessalonians. But here's the question, Eddie. You're God, okay? For the sake of this question, you're God.
Okay.
Okay. And you've decided for some reason, we won't even go into the reason, that you are going to take a portion of yourself or a co-equal with yourself and come down and take human form and sacrifice yourself to serve as a loophole for rules that you have control over. And the evidence that you're going to leave for this is stories that cannot be verified from anonymous authors that are passed around verbally, that are changed and altered. Is that sufficient reason to believe that Jesus was divine, that he was raised from the dead, that he is the one and only way to heaven, or that any of the things that Jesus is supposed to have said are actually true?
But that's not why I called in.
I know. I'm asking. Okay.
What I was saying
okay.
is
Then Eddie.
Yeah.
Then I might as well hang up because I don't disagree with you about the mythicist position. So why are we wasting time on it? I asked a question. I mean, is this sufficient to justify that belief?
The way I have well, first off, just so you know, so we're coming from a level playing field. I don't really have a high view of Scripture. So if you're asking me to say, like, is the Bible the inerrant Word of God? And
sure.
Stuff like, no, I don't have a high view of Scripture. Do I think I'm probably more in the vein of a Dale Martin as far as my belief structure, where I think these guys had a spiritual experience. I think they conveyed it the best they can. I think I personally was an atheist who became a theist because I had some experiences. I'm a rational person. I cannot explain them. I have.
Well, hang on. If you had experiences that you can't explain, then what made you become a theist? Because using theism as the explanation for something you can't explain, now you're contradicting yourself.
No, I'm saying I'm a rational person. I had an experience. And there's validity to it because there's other people that were in the room when I've had that experience. I was with someone who killed himself.
Okay.
And from the point she killed herself on, yes, I'm sure there were things that I hallucinated. I have no doubt in my mind. But then there were other things like, things that moved where people were there to witness it.
Okay. What is the explanation for what you experienced?
I have no idea.
Then how could that possibly be relevant to changing you from an atheist to a theist? If you don't have an explanation, then shouldn't the answer be, I don't know?
No, because when I read the Bible, right, and I read about these experiences that these people probably couldn't explain for their time, and it probably, that's my view of it.
That's like saying that I don't know who killed him, but I read a book about a butler doing it, so I'm going to go with the butler did it.
No, everyone has these. I think anyone who has a legitimate, I don't know, we'll call it a metaphysical experience.
How do you know whether it's legitimate?
Like I said, a couple things that I experienced, I had witnesses.
Okay,
I had like light bulbs. I had light bulbs like literally blow out.
I've had light bulbs blow out too. It didn't make me believe in a God.
I mean blow out like at a point in a conversation when we were talking about the girl that killed herself.
Okay.
Like, and I'm not talking blow out. I'm not talking go out. I'm talking shatter.
Okay.
I'm talking blow up.
And what is the explanation for that light bulb blowing up?
That's just one of many. I'm talking about. That was just one of many, many things.
It doesn't matter if it's one of a gazillion things. I'm asking about the one.
Okay, well, like I say, my rational mind, my scientific mind, would say, hey...
Do you have another mind? Do you have some non-scientific, non-rational mind?
Well, no, I listen to your show, and yeah, I think you get some non-rational people that call in all the time, yes. Absolutely.
Okay.
I consider myself pretty rational.
So do they.
My scientific side would say, how do you test for that? How do we repeat that experiment?
Sure.
You can't.
Why not? You can mention her name again around other light bulbs. Couldn't you?
We could.
Yeah, and then if the other light bulbs don't explode, then you just had a one-off coincidence.
Right.
Okay.
And then...
Have you tried that?
That was just, like I say, that was just one experience.
Well, that's not the issue. Did you actually try it? Just saying that you have other experiences. No. Okay, so then that one experience becomes irrelevant because you haven't bothered to test it. It can't be used as a bit of information included. Now let's go on to your next of a bunch of them.
Okay, so what if the same thing happens? You mention her name and then it falls off the walls at that exact point in time.
Did you try to replicate that as well?
No, because stuff like that...
Okay, so that one's dismissed for the same reason the first one was dismissed, right?
Oh, okay, no, but that's why I don't dismiss them, because it was like, you have to understand the context.
How are you relating it to what was being said as opposed to something like what was on television at the time, or...
Hey, maybe it was just a bunch of coincidences, but if it happens over and over and over again... At some point, it opened my mind.
Right, but what you're basically saying is that if I hadn't been talking about her, the thing wouldn't have fallen off the wall, and I'm wondering how you would know that.
I will say this. Stuff like that didn't happen unless she was mentioned. I know when I moved out of the place, I know the people that moved in after me were having problems there.
Okay, so let's say for just a second.
Were they mentioning her name?
No, but they had weird stuff that happened.
But they didn't. But they weren't talking about her.
So it's not tied to mentioning her name.
Yeah, and here we go. I had a dog at the time. The dog would not go into the room that she killed herself in. That dog was in that room all the time. But the day after she killed herself, that dog would never ever go in that room.
Cool. Why not?
Go right.
Why not?
I have no idea.
Okay,
I have no idea.
Then we'll put that on the pile of we don't know what the explanation is, right?
Right, but
so do you have anything that's not on that pile that you could use to be a convincing argument for why you believe? Because here's the problem.
I'm open-minded.
You're too open-minded because actually you're
it's not open-minded if you've concluded something while you're admitting that you don't know the causes of these things.
No, I'm concluding. No, I think I'm being open-minded because I'm saying prior to those experiences, I believe
was an atheist, and now you believe you're in theism. So you have concluded something here about the explanation.
I concluded that I had too many experiences, and like I say, I'm just telling you a couple
could not be explained.
You had a whole bunch of experiences that you have no explanation for, and then you concluded that the explanation is theism.
Made up an explanation.
Because here's the thing. Let's say for a second that we'll just go with the two examples that we talked about, where a light bulb went out when you mentioned her name, and something fell off a wall when you mentioned
it. Not went out.
Okay, a light bulb exploded and shattered and put glass into your head. It doesn't matter. Let's say that you mentioned her name and a light bulb exploded, and you mentioned her name and something fell off the wall, and you've already acknowledged that you don't have an explanation for what those are. Is it possible that she was there in spirit form and there's also not a God?
Yeah, it could be.
Okay. Is it possible that she wasn't there in spirit form and something else was going on that you don't know?
It could be.
Then how the hell do you get from atheism to theism with 2 more unknowns?
I have a question, though.
Or 20 more unknowns.
I've got a question.
No.
Is it possible that you talked about her more after she died in the house?
Yeah, but you have to, if you understood the context of those situations that I was talking about, it was like one of them I had a friend over, and my friend was kind of talking bad about her when the light bulb blew up. And I even reached out to her recently and said, "Hey, do you remember when this happened? Because this happened a while ago." Mm-hmm. And she said, "Yeah." And same thing. Explain this one to me.
No.
I guess what I'm wondering, like, let's suppose you had been talking about a recipe for carrot soup when the light bulb blew up. I mean, would you be superstitious about discussing recipes?
It probably wouldn't have even registered on the radar then.
Right. So you were predisposed to connect these things, right? You're making a connection between 2 unconnected things. There is no connection between your friend died in the house and light bulb malfunction. I mean, your mind is making a connection, but that you're not actually showing a demonstration that connects these events. That's the problem here, is that your mind is connecting it without that connecting part.
But here's the thing. I wasn't talking about carrots when the light blew up.
Correct.
We were talking about
But
her.
you said if you were talking about carrots, you wouldn't tie it to carrots. And I'm like, well, then why are you tying it to her?
Because that's what I'm saying. When I take the pattern of all the different events,
you are creating the pattern.
Yeah,
I
think you're noticing things. You probably talked about her a lot more after she died in the house. I know I would, and you are connecting anything that occurs. I mean, there's probably was there never a time when you talked about her and something weird didn't happen?
Yeah, but okay, let me throw this one.
This is starting to look really random.
I mean, the reason I interjected a second ago is because the words that came out of your mouth were, "Okay, then explain this to me," and that's significant because it shows that you are inappropriately positioning where the burden of proof is. Because what you're going to do is say, "I have a story that I can't explain. Explain it to me." Because if you don't because if you can't explain it to me, then I'm justified in thinking that it was a ghost and God. That is a fallacy.
But it's not just an experience.
It doesn't matter how many, Eddie. It doesn't matter how many of them there are. The plural of anecdote isn't data.
Right.
A whole bunch of unexplained things doesn't add up to one explained thing.
I gotta challenge you on that though.
Well, okay, then challenge me, because my statement was a whole bunch of unexplained things does not amount to one explained thing. Please argue against that point.
Okay, if you have a bunch of unexplained things, right, but they all seem to point back to one thing, like this person that killed themselves.
How do you know they point back to one thing?
It was either her being mentioned or the first time I went.
So you're saying you have a whole bunch of unexplained things that are correlated with something else.
Yeah, the dog not going in the room.
Correlation isn't causation. I mean, that's the foundations of reason there, to not make the mistake of thinking that because this and this happen together that they're necessarily tied together. Just like
I disagree. I disagree with that because
then you are not a rational person.
Yeah, I mean, I could say
you are throwing logic and reason out the window.
Every morning before the sun comes up, my rooster crows. Every single morning. Does that mean that my rooster crowing causes the sun to rise?
No,
but it happens every morning.
But we correlate data, and then we know the Higgs boson exists.
Okay,
we didn't know that.
We're done, Eddie. We're done.
What?
We're done because at no point in this conversation, nothing about this conversation is relevant to the Higgs boson. You are just now spewing forth words that are irrelevant because when we challenge you, then argue against the point.
You challenge me about correlating data. I correlate data for you and tell you this is there. Here, I give you the scientific example.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't, Eddie. You said a light bulb exploded when we mentioned her name, and when Tracie asked you if you tried to replicate that, which would perhaps be close to scientific, you said no, you didn't. So don't pretend like you're presenting scientific data when you're not.
No, but you're
presenting an anecdote.
Correlation of data. You told me correlation of data doesn't prove causation. I just gave you an example where it does.
No, you didn't.
You're like, oh, this calls over.
You don't understand the difference between correlation and causation. I'm sorry. The accumulation of data that shows a causal connection, that demonstrates a causal connection. By the way, science doesn't make proclamations about what's absolutely true. All it does is demonstrate models that are the best explanation of what we see and observe, and they are always subject to revision.
Right.
What they're saying is the best probable explanation for this set of data is this.
But the thing is, though, you have to have that coupling, right? So it's like you've got to have a theory that explains how this and this actually could be causally connected, and that's what you're missing.
Right, no, and that was my whole point. Like I say, I really did look through all these separate, different events, and it was more than a couple. It was many.
Okay.
And like I say, the only thing I could come up with where it kept coming back was this one thing.
Okay, what is your theory for why mentioning a person's name would make a light bulb explode?
I can't explain it.
That's the difference between what Matt was describing as far as collecting data. If you make a theory about a causal connection and you say, I think this is causing this, and I believe that it's causing it in this way, like you have the theory that explains how it's causing it, then you go in and you start saying, well, if it was causing it this way, then if I do it under these conditions, it shouldn't work. Right, and you start trying to falsify your data by trying to show that the coupling thing that you have built in your model to explain how A and B are connected will or won't work, and you should be able to test for that. What you're saying is, I've got the two things, and I think they're connected, but you're not explaining how you think they're connected. You're saying, we say her name, the light bulb explodes. I believe saying her name is causing the light bulb to explode, and what I'm saying is, what is the theory? Where is your explanation for how that is causing it?
Well, no, I have no other explanation.
You don't have any explanation.
Eddie, wait. Saying I have no other explanation is already a logical fallacy. That is already a logical fallacy. That is the argument from ignorance or argument from incredulity that I can't come up with any better explanation. But it's worse than that because, as Tracie just pointed out, you don't have an explanation. Don't compare this to science or the Higgs boson.
There's no theory here tying these events together. There's just you saying you believe they're tied together, but you don't even have an explanation for how one would even result in causing the other.
Where's your Nobel Prize for linking falling pictures with a god?
I wasn't even going to take us on that jump. I was taking us from the Mythicist position as untenable was where I was kind of going with that. And then I was just telling you why I became a theist or why I became open-minded to it.
Yeah.
Because I've had experiences that I cannot explain. And it's not just a light bulb. I mean, it was
Eddie?
many.
Eddie, if I have some experiences that I can't explain, and then I tell you that I accept an explanation, what would you call that?
If you have a theory that you can't explain.
No, if he has some...
But
I have a number of experiences that I acknowledge are unexplained. And then I tell you, but I've gone ahead and accepted an explanation. Am I rational?
So you're putting... You can be, yeah, because it's just, okay.
Is that rational? Is it rational to say I have several things for which I don't have an explanation, but because of them, I'm going to accept an explanation?
Well, that does not feed into Gödel's ontological argument.
Okay. I asked a question about whether or not something would be rational. I asked a question about whether something would be... Eddie, let me finish. I asked a question about whether or not something would be rational. And once again, you have thrown out something new and irrelevant.
Okay, let me explain how it's relevant.
You're not going to explain how the ontological argument is relevant to pictures falling down and why you accepted that a number of things for which you don't have an explanation add up to an explanation. Has nothing to do with the ontological argument.
No, when you have things that fall outside of a scope of something that, like I said, I gave you a couple examples. There were a bunch of examples.
I don't want you to give me a couple of examples, Eddie. I'm tired of you derailing this. Just address the issue. Because every time we go to new examples, you just acknowledge, yep, I don't have an explanation for that. Yep, I don't have an explanation for that. But all of it adds up and you're wrong.
For those things that I don't have a rational explanation for is where it took me to that. It's the best thing I got right now.
Wait a minute. Eddie, I didn't understand what you said because the phone broke up. You said, for those things for which I don't have a rational explanation, what?
Then I have to theorize.
No. No.
That's what science... That's actually a rational thing.
Okay. For things that you don't have an explanation, what you do is you explore and investigate, and you build a model, and then you test that model. But we've already established that is not what you've done. What you've done is taken things that you don't have an explanation for and gone, I can't think of anything better, therefore God. That's not science. That's not rational.
If you go with the best theory that you have.
No, you don't. No, you absolutely don't. That is how you get ripped off by con men and fooled by magicians. You don't just go, what you do is when you don't have an explanation, you say, I don't yet have an explanation. If you just go with the best thing you can think of, you are going to be conned over and over and over again for your entire life, and you don't get to identify as a rational individual.
Well, I have to disagree.
I know you have to disagree because that's how you protect your irrational beliefs.
I don't know if this would be useful or not, but in the idea about, I have a thing that I can't explain, and then I have another thing that I can't explain, and then I have another thing that I can't explain, and when I get to a certain number of things I can't explain, then I can just make up an explanation, or it becomes an explanation in some way. It's kind of like saying 0 plus 0 doesn't equal 1, but 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0, eventually it will get to 1. But it doesn't get to 1 because there's never, none of these things offer an explanation in and of themselves. Putting them all together in a pile of unexplained things doesn't equal an explanation, just like there's no number of zeros that will eventually amount to 1.
No, but where that's a little bit different is if you're completely closed off to a metaphysical explanation, and then you have a bunch of scenarios.
We don't have a metaphysical explanation, though, is the problem. It's not an explanation.
Not only do we not have a metaphysical explanation, Tracie and I aren't necessarily closed off to metaphysical explanations. What we're doing is saying, if you have an explanation, be it physical or metaphysical, you need to actually demonstrate that. You don't get to just say, I couldn't think of anything better, and this seems good enough. That's not the way reason works.
No, but you're going to go where the evidence leads you, right?
You don't have evidence.
Okay.
The evidence for your thing you've acknowledged leads you nowhere. Here's something I experienced. I don't have an explanation. That, by definition, is the evidence leading you nowhere yet.
Right. And there's an assumption of causation, and even there's an assumption that this person's name being mentioned is causing these events, but you have to go in and figure out how to demonstrate that assumption is not just in your mind.
Okay, what about, I'll give you another scenario. CNN, this is on CNN. I don't know if you saw it. You can Google it. There's a video out there where they went in and did a story on a supposed haunted house, and the cameraman from CNN got attacked. Now, this is CNN.
Okay, so
I don't know if you guys saw it.
Are you saying there aren't people who are rational who work for CNN? Because I don't think that's going to fly right now.
No, but they also have some other recordings from the house. Anyway, so that would be one of those things that I would put in that pile of things where I'm like, it opens my mind to that kind of stuff. This is someone else who had an experience similar to mine, and this was on TV. It just happened.
I'm on TV. CNN. Why don't you believe me?
If you were attacked by a ghost, I would put that in that category.
If I'm attacked by a ghost, you would believe me. But if I explain to you how reason actually works and how you can't possibly get to your conclusion, you're not going to believe me. Then that's good. No, I don't want you to believe me just because I said so, but I'd like you to actually learn something about how to reach reasonable conclusions.
Hey, like I said, I consider myself a very reasonable man. I do. am just open-minded now.
I know you consider yourself reasonable. How do you determine whether or not somebody is actually acting reasonably?
Well, it depends on the situation.
Sure. Okay, so somebody thinks they're convinced that ghosts are real, and what they tell you is, I had some experience for which I don't have an explanation. Are they acting reasonable when they conclude that ghosts are real?
I think when I was sitting on your side of the desk, I probably would have said no way.
Why does it matter which side of the desk you're on? Reason is reason, independent of who says it. It doesn't matter where you have some.
Well, I think when you have some of those experiences that, I can honestly say, had I seen that CNN thing with the cameraman getting attacked, I don't think I would have given it even a moment. I would have probably doubted it or something like that. But
now you don't doubt. So why have you abandoned doubt?
It's not like I arbitrarily just abandoned all forms of doubt. There's still a lot of stuff.
Well, basically what you're saying is, if I used to be an atheist, and once upon a time, if I'd have seen that report on CNN, I probably would have exercised some skepticism with regard to it. But now, because I've experienced things for which I don't have an explanation, I'm going to chuck skepticism out the window and accept that the CNN report was actually a recording of a ghost attacking a human being.
I'm just going to say I'm more open-minded to it, yeah. Whereas before I would have been completely cold.
Eddie, I think we've gone beyond the point of wasted time, because now you're just, I'm more open-minded to it. Well, I'm not closed-minded to it. What I want is actual evidence. But you said you used to be an atheist, and now you're a theist, and the reason for that is something that you can't demonstrate is sufficient to justify it. If I say I have evidence that the butler did it, and we should convict the butler, and what I present to you is stories of other cases where butlers did it, and you go, yeah, and I once knew a butler who did it, so I'm going to go with that because I don't have a better explanation for why Johnny's dead. Are you reasonable?
Not in that scenario, no.
Yeah, thanks.
No, but
it's not different.
Where it would be reasonable.
It's not any different.
No, well, it's a little bit. I think if you were going to make it a more apples to apples comparison, is if there was a string of butler attacks in a certain geographic area.
How do you know that they're butler attacks? See, this is the problem. You are trying to claim that there's a string of ghost encounters, but you don't have any way to demonstrate that those are in fact ghost encounters. So you don't get to call them ghost encounters and then use them as evidence for your preferred ghost encounter.
Okay, whatever we want to call it. Well, and that's where I go with the whole spirit. I mean, I hate saying. I know you hate the word spiritual. I know you hate that because you think it's a loosely defined word.
It is loosely defined, and you're using it to cop out of actually offering an explanation and any evidence for what you believe.
Like I say, I would challenge you on this. Watch that.
I wish you would challenge me on this, but you keep deflecting to ontological arguments and Higgs boson. What's next? Leprechauns?
Well, I don't know. And a lot of the stuff, when I read books about particle physics and even the ontological argument, and even look at John Lennox. John Lennox is a theist, and he's a mathematician. I think you start seeing things a little different in the order of things.
I think you start seeing things a little different if you allow your skepticism to go by the wayside and your biases to take charge, and the experts who are writing the things, who actually do the science, that you are casually reading on the side, don't agree with your conclusion.
No, John Lennox is a mathematician who's a theist.
Okay, I know lots of scientists who are theists.
Francis Collins.
I talk about Francis Collins all the time. Does Francis Collins have any evidence or good reason for his belief? Do you know why Francis Collins is a theist? Do you know what convinced him?
I read the Language of God.
Okay, what convinced him?
What initially convinced him? The waterfall?
Yeah. A waterfall was frozen into 3 columns, and that reminded him of the Trinity, so he hit his knees and he accepted God. What about that is rational? And what about that has anything to do with his expertise as a scientist?
No, but I think that's the point. Like he said in the book, I think he just started viewing things differently.
He viewed them irrationally.
Well, you say irrational. I guess here's where we hit at the loggerheads. You say irrational, and I would say it's just being open-minded. And like I say, I will do this because I don't want to chew up all your time, but I would challenge you. I would love for you to watch that CNN.
I already have it loaded. And you know what else? I can probably just Google CNN ghost attack and find a bunch of people offering this. But here's the thing. What if I watch it and I don't have any explanation for what was going on? What then?
I would, well, and that's where we would differ a little bit, because I would keep an open mind to it.
No, now, you're not answering. You're not answering the question. You are getting closer and closer to word salad. I asked a specific question. If I watch the video and I don't have any explanation for what actually happened there, what conclusion can I reach?
You're probably going to reach the conclusion that you have no explanation for it.
Okay. What conclusion should I reach?
It depends. It depends. Like I said,
no, it doesn't depend. Reason doesn't change whether I'm using it or you're using it. What conclusion? Somebody watches that CNN video, and they don't have any explanation for what went on. What reasonable conclusion should they reach about that?
It depends. Probably. Well,
it doesn't depend, Eddie. It doesn't depend. It doesn't depend on your frame of mind or your spirituality or your scope of what you might have read or whatever else. Based on the facts, if a person cannot explain something, then that is the conclusion. I have no explanation for this. If somebody else can explain it, then they can present that explanation and the reason behind it. And as Tracie was pointing out, the methodology that links that to make it a reasonable explanation. And once you have that information, it might be reasonable to reach a conclusion. But if you say, I've watched that and I have no explanation for what that is, that's the conclusion, that's the point. You don't get to just add to it.
I didn't want to drag the call on, so I didn't want to introduce something new, but it reminds me, it's almost like the opposite of calls or letters that we get from people who are like, I started to understand the illogic of my belief in God, and now I'm looking back at these things that I thought were like these spiritual experiences or these unexplained things, and I realize now that it's just unexplained things, and that there's really no rational reason to assign an explanation to something if the reality is I don't know what happened.
This is people's discomfort with being able to say, I don't know.
I'm just saying it's funny that we get the same letters and calls in reverse. Yeah. People that have said, I've had these experiences and I am still beginning to see why assigning God to it is irrational.
Yeah. I had these experiences, and for a number of reasons, I attributed them to God or the supernatural.
Yeah.
I stood in church for many years, and I would feel the euphoria that I would attribute to the Holy Spirit. Why? Because that's what everybody else around me attributed it to.
Yeah.
And when you're in that mindset, when you're in that context, it feels reasonable. It feels rational. It's not.
It reminds me, too, though, of a little book that I brought in. It was just a journal, but on the cover it said, pray until something happens. And it made me laugh, right? Like, I mean, the thing about it is it's a theistic statement. Yeah. Like, they intend it to be a certain way, but when you read it as an atheist, it's really funny because it's almost like when my mother used to say she had the magic chant to turn the light green in traffic. And you just say the magic chant and just keep saying the magic chant till that light turns green, right? And it'll turn green. Something is going to happen eventually in your life. So, yeah, if you keep praying, something's going to happen. But I got news. If you don't pray at all, something's going to happen. So it's kind of a funny thing. There's a lot of phrases like that I take differently now. Like, God helps those who helps themselves.
Yeah.
I look at that completely differently now. It's such an atheistic statement.
God picks up this envelope every time I pick it up. Look at that. Thanks, God.
Well, and also, if you want that envelope picked up, you'd better pick it up yourself, because God, if you're waiting for God to do it, ain't gonna happen. So it's really interesting how these things kind of take on a different nuance. It's spooky.
I realize that there's a lot of coincidences that happen that are spooky, and we draw these connections.
We do.
Oh, I said her name, and then the light blew out. Oh. And I loved it. You're like, why didn't you try that again? Did you try that again? No.
Go get another light bulb, or go stand by another light bulb.
And I think one of the reasons that people don't necessarily try that again is fear, and not just fear of, oh my gosh, I'm going to say her name and I'm going to lose another light bulb, and I'm out another $3 or $30 if it's one of those LED fancy ones. It's fear that they'll say her name and it won't happen. So now we're in that scenario, much like the experiments where the chickens end up training themselves.
Yeah.
So random things will happen when they peck on the thing, and then they develop all sorts of rituals. Oh, if I scratch my right leg twice and twist a little and then peck, I get the food. When that has absolutely nothing to do with it. We draw these connections because we're not all that much brighter than chickens when it comes to things we can't explain.
Bird brains.